Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a dream. A dream that requires pushing boundaries and pushing for radical change. So as I dream, please allow me to continue. So I'm going to talk about the international intellectual property system. So intellectual property is a mouthful, but we are simply talking about ideas, creativity, and innovation. So in 1421, the first patent was issued to an Italian engineer. That was the birth of the IP system. Fast forward, 1883. The first international treaty for the protection of industrial property was signed on 20 March in 1883 in Paris, in France. This is the very same international treaty that almost the whole of the African continent is party to. But guess what? When the foundation was built, Africa was not there. When the conversation started, Africa was not there. That's the period, for contextual purposes, the scramble for Africa, 1800 to 1900. Did we have enough innovation and creativity to be protected under this treaty? Probably not. And what did that do? We get to a space where Africa falls into what I call intellectual property socialization, or in simpler terms, peer pressure. So as that happens, African governments, as they try to build contextual systems that address the continent's developmental stages, they face a challenge. International practices, international standards. The same standards that were created when Africa was not there. Now, let's look at some figures, interesting facts and figures. The biggest driver of the patent system is called the Patent Cooperation Treaty, or the PCT. And again, almost the whole continent is a signatory. There's no doubt about the benefits of the system when it comes to international protection of innovation. An easy process, cost-effective process. You can cover the world in a simple process. But does that apply to Africa? Is it the same for the continent? Let's look at the figures. 3.5 million patents in 2022, according to the World Intellectual Property Facts and Figures. 48% China. 64% China and the US. 0.7% Africa. Now, as we look at the 0.7, let's dig deeper. 4,690 resident applications, which means the actual Africans on the continent. That's 0.134% of 1.5 billion people. Now, if you're a policymaker or a leader, would you sign up to something that will benefit 0.134 of 1.5 billion? But we did. Now, when we look at the benefits, they don't speak to Africa. Where are we in this space? Where is our stronghold? When you talk about intellectual property, we actually have plenty. We are super strong. We've got traditional knowledge. We've got biodiversity. We've got traditional cultural expressions. For those who have experienced the African culture, the Zimbabwean culture in particular, if you've been to the Victoria Falls, you've seen so many different traditional dances, traditional cultural expressions. And guess what? They get used in movies, they get used in musical videos, and we scream on social media. But the question is, did we put the framework? In the year 2000, something was created under the World Intellectual Property Organization. It's called the Intergovernmental Committee on the Protection of Intellectual Property, Traditional Knowledge, and Genetic Resources. The idea was that as the foundation of the IP system was built, Africa was not there. The same applies to what we have. It was not considered. So as that committee was established, it was, number one, to look at looking at traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, biodiversity, which is a key source of pharmaceuticals, to find a way of protecting them under the intellectual property systems, because they were not considered. But again, if you go back to my point, we signed up for that, but we were not part of the conversation. Now, 24 years down the line, we don't have an international treaty that speaks to Africa's stronghold. Why? That's the question, and I hope it will be answered. Why has it taken so long? I'll give you some examples. When it comes to Africa's stronghold, where do we draw a line as this happens? Because we didn't put systems, but we have an opportunity. I'll take you to the World Cup 2010. The World Cup theme song. This is Africa, or Waka Waka. There was so much noise because it came from the Golden Sounds, a Cameroonian group. At the end of it all, it was settled. The 2019 Zara Makosa case, the fashion brand, they commercialized the beadwork of the South African Xhosa people. Again, we made noise. The Masai Shuka in Kenya and Tanzania. I'm sure part of the audience, you have come to know about that, that design through Gucci. But for the East Africans, they established the Maasai IP Institute to challenge all those big brands that were using their traditional brand without authority and without compensating the communities. But again, the question still remains, where do we draw a line? Is it okay to borrow and just walk away? If we are to pay, where is the framework? We are yet to build it. But again, there is the international standards to follow. The same international standards that do not look at what we hold dearly or what we are strong on as a continent. Now, I said I was dreaming, and here is my dream. Africa's own contextual intellectual property system, driven by Africans. A system that gives clarity to the world in terms of who we are as a people. A system that gives clarity to the pharmaceutical companies when it comes to our biodiversity. Growing up in the countryside, I knew a number of plans and what they would do in terms of health. It's the same plans that have delivered pharmaceuticals. But the very same place on the countryside, that was the source. They have no idea. They are still in the global south that struggles to access medicines. African Union, headquartered in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, that's where my dream sits, where the Pan-African Intellectual Property Office will sit, driving the intellectual property agenda of the continent, instead of our leaders flying over to Geneva, Switzerland. That's the Pan-African in me. So, as I speak about the Pan-African Intellectual Property Office, forget the third forces. The statute was approved in 2016, and only 9 countries have signed up out of 54. Only Tunisia has ratified, and the journey continues. We're in 2024. But despite that, I continue to dream. It's the very same dream that transitioned the psychology in me to an intellectual property lawyer. It's the very same dream that has taken that same person to take a role as the executive director of the International Panel of African Legislators Advancing African IP, an institution that will build capacity in parliamentarians to look at Africa, to consider Africa, and to legislate according to the continent's developmental context. Ladies and gentlemen, dreams come through action. I've done my part, and I leave it to you to do your part for your country and for your continent. I thank you.